I'm about to break every plant rule you've ever heard. And you know what? My plants are fine. Hi, my name is Memo. This is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me. It's tropical houseplants. So yes, very much a video that's going to be about rules are there to be broken, but there is good reason for that. What if I was to tell you that this Begonia ferox is in just regular potting mix? Or that this crown of thorns is in a terracotta pot? And how about a plant that I only ever bottom water? And a plant that, for all intents and purposes, is in a window that is way too bright? Because we need to remember that houseplant rules are environmental shortcuts, not laws. But how about we understand a bit more about the kind of mentality of rules, at least within our little kind of bubble of the world, which is to do with plants and specifically tropical houseplants. What's the kind of psychology there? So the first thing I think that we all kind of need to kind of be aware of and acknowledge is that part of it is to simplify something that is complex. So if you think about it, it would be overwhelming, especially if you're a beginner, but even if you're not a beginner, even if you are just somebody who has a relatively large collection that you've acquired over weeks, months, or even years, if you were to give very unique, very, very highly specialized conditions and care to every single one of your plants. I am looking at the people that still maybe haven't downsized and have still got hundreds of plants. That would just make things a bit too much. You know, simplicity is something there that it is essentially what it says on the tin. It's supposed to make something that's really, really complicated because you need to have all the plates spinning into something simple and easy to kind of manage. It's also there, like the rules or kind of rules of kind of caring for certain houseplants or all houseplants are there a lot of the time to kind of protect the beginners. So when you're first starting off, you're not going to know everything that somebody who's been doing this for years will know, and being able to pick up certain things about the way maybe this plant looks like this, or it's got this morphology, or the roots look like this, or the leaves look like that. So I probably need to be doing this based on all the lived experiences that I've had with my entire other plants in my collection, basically. That's not going to be something that a beginner is going to know. So they need something easy to grasp, which rules tend to be, so that they can kind of get going. And I do know there's a lot of us out there, the ones that have even been doing it for a long time, that we still lean a bit on the rule because it's a bit like, oh, this is a bit of a cheat code. Let me just, at least that's a place to start rather than going into the unknown for every single plant. And ultimately, they're also there to prevent obvious mistakes. So somebody maybe who hasn't experienced the specific plant or a specific type of plant, they're going to need to be there in order to at least guide them into not making the obvious mistakes. So a really simple example would be somebody literally taking a calathea or a prayer plant or any plant that is shade loving to a certain degree or is used to growing at the kind of base of the jungle floor with a canopy of plants above it or trees, and there's a lot of, it's used to having more filtered and more kind of medium to maybe towards low light, and sticking it in the brightest window where you would normally stick a cactus. Because if you don't know, if you've never experienced that plant before, how are you to know that that plant needs lower lights? Like everybody always says, like, plants need light to survive and to do all these things. Great, I'm going to take this calathea and make it a crispy calathea by putting it in a window so it will just turn into dust. That's another point where rules can help. But problems will start to occur when people follow these rules without context, and also not realizing that advice sometimes ignores environmental situations as well. So think about it a bit clearer with this one. So Depending on where you are and depending on your conditions, the common rule for taking care of a philodendron, for instance, might not apply to you. It might be different because of your light levels, your humidity levels, your watering kind of tendencies and all of these things. So that is going to be different. And again, you can see how the environment and also the care that you're providing it changes. And it changes how you need to interpret that rule, whether or not you actually listen to it at all. So let's talk about one of the first rules, which is you always need to use a chunky Aroid mix in all of your houseplants. First thing, I'll get this out straight away. You might not also be caring for an Aroid. It's a boon if you are aware that you are growing an Aroid, so you're doing the Aroid thing with it, but again, if you're starting off, you might not know whether or not this specific plant is an Aroid. This one is, by the way. And thanks to everybody for kind of telling me what I finally got to understand by the end of a few videos. This is most definitely an Epipremnum pinnatum variegated, basically, rather than whatever the shop was selling it as. I think it was some form of Skindaps's basket. But yeah, so for example, the edict for something like an Epipremnum, like a Monstera deliciosa, for example, would be, you need to put it in chunky soil mix, as airy as absolutely possible. And by and large, that can apply. However, you need to use some critical thinking and to just kind of adjust accordingly, because the rule, as I said, is not the law. So there's always going to be that balance, specifically in this situation, where it's kind of soil type versus aeration. But also you need to be thinking about light intensity will kind of dictate the watering needs of a plant. So for example, if you were to put this in a slightly darker location, yeah, this or a Monstera deliciosa or any other plant that needs to be in a chunky Aroid mix, and if you put it in a really low light condition, even if you ignore everything else, yes, a chunky Aroid soil mix there would probably be a good thing because it's not getting blasted by light, thus not needing to use water as quickly because it just doesn't have the light stress there to kind of go, okay, we need to grow super fast, look at all of this light, like, go, 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 go. Now imagine if the same plant was somewhere that was a lot brighter. You could just have this in regular potting mix, basically, whatever that might mean in your location. It might just be, if you're using kind of coco coir, it might just be straight up coco coir. With a lot of the times, if you're buying commercially, a lot of these plants will just come into coco coir, and everybody's very quick to go, I need to repot this right now. Do you need to repot it right now? Because if you're going to put it in a location where the light level is maybe a bit brighter than what the plant needs, you're going to want that soil media. Yes, it still needs to have aeration. It's still an Aroid. It still needs kind of air to go towards its roots. But if the soil media is still good with that, you don't have to go the full hog and go super, super, super chunky, because all you're doing at that point is you're going to have to water that plant an awful lot more than if you just left it to sit in the pure coco coir. You can still get some aeration from there as long as it's not compacted. There's other issues there, but you need to adjust based on the environment. So higher light doesn't always necessarily mean it's going to need a chunkier soil mix. It needs aeration, but it needs something that you can handle, not watering it every day. And if you're in a lower light condition, then yes, by all means, do give it that chunky Aroid soil mix. Your plant and its roots will thank you for that. And the most important thing that you need to take away from this bit is that soil is in response to the environment. It's not the identity of the plant. It's really easy for us to kind of go, it's an Aroid, so it needs to go into a chunky Aroid mix. Yes and no. Again, remember the environmental examples that I've just given there. That's what's going to dictate the soil, not the fact that you are growing an Aroid. And how about another rule that everybody's always kind of touting around is that you should never water on a schedule. Never ever do that. It's going to cause no end of problems to all of your plants. Okay, and before I hear people say it in the comments, yes, schedules can be risky at times when they are done without any thought behind them. However, routine is not necessarily evil. So let me put that into context as well. If light and humidity are stable, so if you know for a fact I'll give you an example, a very, very controlled example. This could also apply to windows, but say you've got something in one place of your house, the temperature of that location doesn't really change, the humidity level doesn't really change throughout the year, and it's under a grow light that you are controlling, and you know exactly how bright it is and how long the light stays on for. Granted, I'm not going to talk about the plant growing closer to the grow light, that's a separate story, but that just means that a schedule in that situation probably isn't bad because nothing is variable at that point. It's the same conditions all the way through. So by and large, the only adjustment that you might need to be making there is growth. So for instance, if you're in active growth, and to be fair, if the conditions are really stable, you're probably permanently going to be in active growth because there's no temperature change, there's no light change, there's no humidity change. It's stable. That plant will be growing all the time at the same rate that it is growing now, if that makes sense. Again, this could also work for windows. Granted, there's a bit more variability there, but a better way of starting to think about it, and me and a lot of other people have said this before, by all means, keep the schedule, keep the routine, but maybe instead of going directly into, I need to water right now because this is what my schedule is telling me, maybe at that point just go, what I need to do right now is first check and then water. And a lot of the times, depending on the type of plant, they will show you relatively quickly if they are thirsty as well. Again, not all plants, but some plants that are very good at communicating. And I know both of these are very traumatic to people, one being calatheas. If you underwater a calathea, a lot of the times, and this is not the only reason why a calathea will do it, you'll start getting the leaves turning into little cigars, and the queen of most expressive houseplant out there, which again could be a bit triggering for people, the humble spathiphyllum, or the peace lily, that will be the most dramatic droop ever. Phytonias are another one that will do that as well. Plants have a way of communicating with you. Do you need to always be doing that all the time and waiting for these plants to show you that extreme level of stress and communicate that maybe we've gone dry for a bit too long all the time? Yes, that could lead to problems, but that will help you adjust your routine and your water checking, basically. So whether or not it's sticking a finger in to the soil or using something like a moisture meter or a chopstick or anything like that, it's going to be something that you're going to get better at doing. And I know a lot of people that have been dealing with collections and loads of houseplants for a while. They know this, but it's also a good thing to remember on occasion, because some of us all forget. We get so used to going, well, I know I shouldn't be on a schedule, but this is the day that I water everything and I need to be doing this. Just a little adjustment of check before you water. And how about the low light myth, basically, that certain plants will do better in low light? And I've got two examples here that a lot of the times people would assume. So this is a Sansevieria samurai, or now reclassified as Dracaena, but this is a samurai variant. And this is the orange flash, I think. So this is related to the humble spider plant. Granted, it's a slightly fancier version of a spider plant, but still related to the spider plant. And both of these are meant to be low light plants. Again, here you can insert any whole slew, like a traditional Sansevieria or a ZZ plant. A lot of plants, ferns, because I don't talk about ferns enough in my channel, but ferns is another one that's traditionally meant to be a low light plant. But this is the point that we need to kind of start reminding ourselves of. Low light might just mean tolerant, and it doesn't necessarily mean thriving. There's a good reason why I've brought out both of these plants. Same thing goes for the mention that I had before of some of my ferns as being low light plants, because these two plants that are looking exceptionally healthy are both in a south facing window without a net curtain. Can you see any problems whatsoever? They are growing substantially well. Same thing, granted, there is some adjustments that need to happen for ferns, but a lot of times with ferns, if you are in a household environment, sometimes the bright windows are still probably going to be a good option for your ferns. Because remember, let me paint a picture, and I can do this because I'm in a conservatory, so I have a situation where I'm getting light from all directions, as if it was outside, as if these plants were outside. It's just protected with all the glass from the, the weather and the elements. But in this situation, I'm getting light from all over the place. So yes, in this situation, my ferns and some of my lower light plants, so some of the plants that are used to being on the jungle floor, in here, under these conditions, they are on my lower shelves, which means they're getting shaded by pretty much every other plant above them on the shelves. However, in a household environment, so for instance, when this is sitting in my south-facing window, you need to remember the only light that is getting, and this, imagine that my hand is the window, is getting light from here. There's no light from above it or any other direction. So by default, that is still for plants that are used to or only ever are growing naturally outside in nature, that is starting to lean towards medium light. Are you going to have to maybe do some adjustments if you live in a very sunny, very bright, very warm locale? And I know a couple of people that watch me from Greece, they always are asking me to talk about ferns. Ferns is another good example here. And what their situation might be, yes, they might need to pull things a bit further back and give it a bit less light, because otherwise it might fry, because they have got blaring light for months on end. That's different. But for the average person, maybe in the Northern Hemisphere, in the slightly grayer parts of the world, I'm based in the UK, so it's grey for a large chunk of the year. Brighter light, the rule of low light means that these plants are going to be happy, busted. And you also need to remember things like a Sansevieria, where are they coming from? Same with the ZZ plant. Where are they coming from? Yes, they might be growing under plants in a bit of shade. But if I'm not mistaken, both Sansevierias originally and ZZ plants originate from Africa. Think about your concept of Africa. And I know before anybody says this, especially if I've got people watching this from any of the nations of Africa, yes, there are also parts of Africa that tend to be a bit like a lot of people sometimes in the kind of north or in the west basically will think of Africa and almost immediately assume Sahara Desert or kind of safaris and things like that. I'm sorry to burst the bubbles of everybody who has not been to any of the African nations. There are parts of Africa that are luscious and green and things like that. So your concept, Africa is not a monolith, it's multiple countries. So yes, but as a continent, if you think about it, what's your first thought? You kind of think of bright light and warmth and heat and all of these things. So some of these plants, again, check where they're coming from. Low light tolerant just means slower or no growth. And I've always made this joke about the ZZ plant. You can put it in a dark cupboard for the year and at best it won't die. It's not growing. It's tolerant is even a strong word in that situation, but it's not dying. That doesn't mean that the plant is necessarily thriving. So remember that when you start looking at some of these rules, as in low light plants need to be in a low light position. A lot of the times, no. How about the rule that humidity is everything? These plants are tropical plants. They're coming from rainforests. They're used to stupid levels of high levels of humidity. It needs to be done. You need to buy that humidifier. You need to turn your house into a swampy jungle. Not always the case. And I'm brought up a very, very sad looking Calathea. So this is the Calathea White Fusion. I was sold this as something else, but I'm pretty sure it's a White Fusion at this particular moment in time. And you are the first one to turn around and say, but Memo, that looks like crap. And I'm not going to deny that. I've got better looking Calatheas, but I thought I'd bring up this as an example for this because this plant had pretty much gone down to nothing. It was getting a lot of humidity. I was putting it in a position that I know. It was getting some decent grow lights. And it was a place that there was no fans around it. So there was a lot of humidity around there, really, really high levels of humidity. This struggled. So humidity is only one factor and it depends on the plant, but there's also other factors. Remember that I was talking about environmental situations that you need to consider. And one of them is airflow matters almost as much as humidity. And I've done a whole video about airflow and I will put it at the top there. That was a difficult word, airflow. But it is one of those things that you need to remember that it helps because yes, a lot of humidity can be quite good, but hands up down in the comments below, how many people have had like powdery mildew or things like that in plants that are meant to be in high humidity and you're just like, but I've done everything right. I've even put you in a closed terrarium. The humidity is as high as it could be. Is the air moving? Because again, the jungle is not a monolith. It's not like every single like tropical rainforest is a huge terrarium. Some people might say it is, but there is still wind. There is still air movement coming throughout those jungles, which helps with things like transpiration as well. There's also another notion of root health here that also needs to be played. It needs to be a part of this conversation where people a lot of the times forget because sometimes humidity or humidifiers specifically, everybody's like, well, you 100% need to use a humidifier with that plant. If, and this can be challenging, I'm not saying it is easy, if your watering is 100%, and this is the challenging bit, 100% what this plant needs, your humidity becomes a lot less important because it can then get all of the moisture that it needs from the soil and from its roots. Granted, I'm not saying to have this in a location that's only got like 10% humidity in the middle of a desert, that's different. But if you've got it in regular household humidity without a humidifier and the watering is on point, the rule that you must have humidity becomes less important because the plant is going to get all of the moisture needs that it needs from the soil and it's going to rely less on the ambient humidity around it. Yes, in nature, they would have a lot of ambient humidity around them. However, in nature, it's not perfect either. They're not always going to be as wet in exactly the right conditions that they need all of the time. But I know there's a lot of perfectionists out there. I did a whole video about like a perfect plant. So I know there's a lot of people out there that's doing this and they are keeping their plants in quote unquote the perfect condition overall. Humidity should be less of an issue and less of a rule for you because it is getting most of what it needs there. Think about the humidity and the humidifiers more as an insurance policy for if you're not doing things 100% right, which for a lot of the time, that's most people. But it doesn't need to be the be all and end all of everything, basically. So that rule busted as well. So the one real rule I think that should exist out there is that balance is key. So if you'd imagine that light, water, air, imagine this as a triangle basically. So if light goes up, if you get more light, you need to be watering more. If you're then increasing the water, you also need to be increasing the airflow in order to help with that transpiration. You can see how all of these things are a balancing act and they are all interconnected with themselves in that triangle to be like, okay, if I'm making this adjustment, probably what needs to happen is the other adjustment needs to happen at the same time. Changing one variable means that most of the time the other two variables also need to adjust. Again, things are not a monolith. They are interconnected. So when changing one thing, you do need to change other elements of the care at the same time. Same thing goes, let's bring the inverse of that. If watering goes down, if you want to water things less frequently, get it to somewhere where there's less light. And at that point, the airflow becomes less important, although arguably, again, depending on the plant, you still might want the airflow in order to dry that pot out a bit faster. But if you are watering less and you're giving it less light, that becomes less important at that point. But airflow to the roots or air to the roots then does become important. But let's come into some of my final thoughts for this. And I know there's going to be a lot of people, maybe people that are starting, even people that are not just starting, people that have been doing this for a while. We can all not necessarily lose our way, but forget some of the basics years, months later they've been doing this and it's just like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Oh, ugh. And then you learn the lesson because the way that we all learn lessons, and I will hold your hand whilst I say this, is by making mistakes. And usually making mistakes means killing plants, but it is part of the process. So you need to remember that sometimes If you're getting down on yourselves because you've not followed the rules, it isn't that the rules are the absolute law that I was talking about before. It's that nobody's really explained the system to you. It's nobody's kind of sat there and just kind of gone, the environment needs to be taken into consideration with these rules. Your care needs to be taken into consideration when it comes to the rules. The location of where the plant came from also needs to be taken into consideration. So again, it's not that you're failing at doing these rules and that's why you don't have a green thumb. There is no such thing as a green thumb. If you want to think of it as a green thumb, you need to also think about the fact that people that you think have got green thumbs have got a slew of dead plants behind them in their past in order to get that green thumb. It's a rite of passage. So don't be too down on yourself and start, if you can, thinking of it in context and use, I sound like a teacher in school, use some critical thinking. Do your research, see what your conditions are and what you need to be adjusted. Because essentially, we are trying to replicate as closely as possible the conditions of some of these plants that are growing in a jungle in our home. So lower light, lower watering, higher light, more watering, more airflow. All of these things you need to start considering. And also, like the example that I was giving before, some of these plants like the Sansevierias or the ZZ plants that might be coming in from the kind of African continent, if they're growing, and again, depending on the nation in Africa that they're growing, if they're growing somewhere where it's super bright and super warm and super dry all the time, how you need to start thinking about how am I going to replicate this rather than just going on the label and say, this needs to be placed in a bright indirect light and watered once a week and I need to do that 100%. It even said that I maybe need to give it some humidity. I'm going to do all of that. Critical thinking. Critical thinking is a good thing, and break the rules. You don't need my permission, but I'm giving you this permission. Break the rules if it means that it works in your conditions and under your care. You would be surprised. But before I let you go, tell me down below what rules were there that you broke and what the results were, good and bad. Let's use this as a kind of learning experience for everybody down below. But yes, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.